Welcome to the Youth Sport Podcast. My name is Rihanna Poskin, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly within youth sport. It feels great when a kid comes up to you and says, "Coach, because of you, my life changed in the best way." It would feel awful to hear that because of you, the coach, a kid doesn't want to have anything to do with it ever again. I believe that kids deserve to have fun, to learn, to grow, to compete, and to play in a great environment. Join me as I interview guests that spill the tea on youth sport in order to help you make an enormous impact with kids right now. This episode of the Youth Sport Podcast is brought to you by Lululemon. I am part of the Lululemon Collective and will receive commissions when you shop through my link. Buying something for you or your loved ones, like my favorite warm down joggers, helps me to continue to bring interesting and empowering conversations for everyone. I have to tell you, when I'm coaching, I want to make sure that I'm dressed appropriately, I'm comfortable, my clothes stand up to all kinds of random situations, and that I have pockets. You never know who's going to ask you to hold something for them or what random things you need to carry with you. The Lululemon warm down joggers take care of all of my needs. I invite you to find your go-to item by browsing through the entire Lululemon site. You won't be disappointed. Please use the link provided in the video description below to start shopping. Welcome back to another episode of the Youth Sport Podcast. I am so excited to introduce my guest to you. This conversation is going to be a little bit different, and you're going to see why. The topic of this conversation is head injuries, contact sports, CTE, and ALS. I'm really happy to introduce my guest, Matthew Onyshko, to you. Matthew Onyshko is a former NCAA Division II football athlete who is battling a condition called CTE ALS. Officially, a CTE diagnosis cannot be determined until after death, yet this is what Matthew's doctors suspect he has. Matthew and I have been communicating through email since his condition does not allow him to communicate verbally. For that reason, my husband, Mike, will read his answers to my questions on his behalf. Matt and I went to school together. He played football at California University of Pennsylvania, and I was working with his team as a student athletic trainer. Now, years went by, and I found out that Matt had ALS when I saw him on the Ellen DeGeneres show. I was watching the show and looked up and thought, wait, this guy looks really familiar. Sure enough, it was a Cal U graduate that I had known when I was also in school. Ellen highlighted Matt's story because his amazing firefighting team worked extra shifts to cover Matt's salary after he was no longer able to work due to his progressing ALS disease. You can find that clip on YouTube to see him in 2014 with his beautiful wife and children. Now, I asked Matt to share his story with me after reading Dr. Julie Stamm's book, The Brain on Youth Sport. In her book, she shared that there is an increase in developing ALS due to playing contact sports and sustaining head impacts. I immediately thought of Matt and was curious if his diagnosis could be related to his years of playing contact football. Sure enough, when I did a quick Google search to find out how to track Matt down, the first headline that popped up was Pennsylvania court sides with NCAA in appeal by disabled ex-football player. Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. The disabled ex-football player was Matthew Onyshko. Matt addresses his lawsuit in this interview against the NCAA, but that's not going to be the main focus of this conversation. Just to give you some context about that lawsuit, I'm just going to read you a quote from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Quote, Mr. Onyshko claimed in his suit that the ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, that afflicts him can be traced to his days playing as a linebacker for California University of Pennsylvania from 1999 to 2003. He cited numerous head injuries he suffered on the gridiron and said he was knocked unconscious 3 times. He contended the NCAA didn't give him adequate warnings about concussion injury dangers and didn't have effective guidelines for identifying players who were at risk due to such injuries, and to govern when or if they could return to the field. A Washington County jury ruled in favor of the NCAA following a trial on the dispute 2 years ago. Mr. Onyshko testified during the trial by using a computerized device activated by eye movement. He sought more than $9 million in damages. Mr. Onishko's playing days ended a decade before the medical outcry that prompted stricter rules regarding football concussion injuries to be adopted by the NFL and the NCAA, end quote. Now, in order to make sure that I was doing this episode properly, I sent the NCAA a message asking for them to comment on this podcast episode. And a spokesperson replied and said, quote, "We do not have further comment beyond the court's decision and appellate rulings in the NCAA's favor," end quote. Okay, so this whole conversation is beyond this lawsuit, and Matt would like to share his story and his experience in the hopes that we can do better in sport, specifically in contact sports like football. He hopes sport organizations and those involved in the organizations do better with the research that is currently available. This means making changes to limit the amount of head impacts athletes sustain and having health and safety guidelines to protect and warn athletes of the risks they undertake. Unfortunately, Matt cannot prove that he has ALS CTE due to football in college because CTE cannot be diagnosed until after death at this point in time. But Matthew plans on having his court case continue beyond his death with his autopsy report in order to make the impact that he is so passionate in making, to have sport organizations take responsibility for putting athletes at risk when changes should have been made and amends should have been met for preventable harm athletes have endured. Matt has graciously agreed to share what he's been through so that coaches and parents can learn what potential consequences could be from playing contact sports. I would like to thank Matt for sharing his story, and I truly hope that through listening to him, we can all make our own impact on youth sport in order to help kids continue to move, have fun, and have the chance to live a full life on their terms. This conversation will be part 1 of 2. In part 2, I have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Thor Steen, who is part of the neuropathology core of the SLIBU CTE Brain Bank, where he conducts neuropathological analysis of brain tissue and helps maintain the brain bank. Dr. Steen helps us understand more about what can happen to the brain and how we can make better decisions for the sake of our youth. Okay, so we're going to get into this. It's been so nice to communicate with Matt through email. And Matt, I just want to thank you so much for doing this, for taking the time to put this together with me. And it's been really lovely to communicate with you after all of these years. Now I will have my husband, Mike, step in, and he's going to be answering the questions on behalf of Matt. Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to get started. At what age, Matt, did you start playing football?
Age 10.
I know that football culture in the United States has many levels. Did you make the choice to play, or were you influenced by others?
My earliest memories were playing football in the street with my brother. I guess I was influenced. It was just something everyone did.
And now, did your personality fit in with the football culture? You know, like some kids are shy, quiet, reserved, while others are high energy and wild and aggressive in nature.
My personality definitely fit an athlete. I was a big kid, couldn't sit still, and always roughhousing.
So, talking about tackling, when did you start tackling?
We always played tackle football. I wasn't properly taught, though, until I started organized football at 4th grade.
Okay. Were there any restrictions on how many head impacts you could have at that young age?
There were never any restrictions on hitting. The only health topic while I was playing was hydration.
Okay. And now, what were your coaches like? Do you have good stories, any stories with coaches that were problematic?
I can honestly say that I have had great coaches at every level I played at.
Oh, that's awesome. Did you know anything about concussions or head injuries while you were playing football at a young age?
Head injuries are something I didn't know anything about while I was playing. I thought a concussion is when you got knocked unconscious, but hadn't really knew why.
Did you have athletic trainers at your games? And if so, were the coaches respecting them?
Athletic trainers started coming to the games while I was in high school. They were always respected by coaches.
Okay, so that's good to know. Did you suffer any concussions or other injuries?
No, I was never diagnosed with a concussion, but now knowing the symptoms, I would say I have easily had over 20, but no other injuries.
Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot. Okay, now thinking about where you played, because when we talked to Dr. Steen, the position of play actually comes up. So, what position did you play?
I played linebacker and tight end.
And what were your practices like in youth football?
Youth practices were mainly conditioning, but no real hitting.
Okay. And did you enjoy playing? Did football give you anything that helped you in your personal life as a young athlete, like confidence or building friendships, purpose in life in general, the sense of belonging, those kinds of things?
I always loved playing football. It was fun, gave me confidence, work ethic, goals, kept me out of trouble, and some great friends.
Awesome. Was there anything that you didn't like about the game?
When I was younger, I hated practice, but as I got older, I started to realize the benefits of practice and I started to learn to enjoy them.
Okay, so moving on to university, what made you want to play football in university?
Playing football seemed like it would help me get through college. I wasn't really interested in academics. I knew football would help me get through school. I didn't really see myself in college without playing a sport.
Okay, and that seems pretty common for a lot of athletes. Now, did you end up getting a scholarship?
I eventually earned a scholarship.
Okay. How many practices would you say you had in preseason, and what were they like in college?
In college, there were probably between 30 to 40 practices, and they would go full maximum effort.
Okay. Now, I was a student athletic trainer with your program, and I didn't know about limiting the amount of head impacts you players should have. I just went along with what the coaches were lining up for practices. Did you have a sense that it was ever too much? And if you had concerns, could you voice them? And if you could, would they be well received?
The number of practices allowed were set by the NCAA. I didn't think it was too much, but anything to get better to me was best. Coaches were pretty good at seeing if they needed a night off or not. And when guys got tired or injuries occurred, is when they typically were able to have a night off.
Okay. Did you ever feel as though you were expendable on the football field, that there could have been someone to replace you?
Absolutely. There was always a D1 transfer who would come in at my position. I knew if I took a play off for any reason, that my starting job would be in jeopardy.
Now, how many head impacts do you think you sustained over the course of your football career?
Thousands of impacts. I don't know what a magic number is, but I think when you get to the college level, guys are too big, strong, and fast to have any impacts.
Okay, that's really interesting. And that's crazy to think about. Now, can you just tell us a little bit about how these head impacts affect the brain?
So these impacts cause the brain to smack against your skull. Just because your body stops moving, your brain is still bouncing back and forth inside your skull, and the bruising creates a protein called tau. Tau is like a plaque that stops the electrical signals in cells.
Just as a sidebar to this, I just want to interrupt real quick in this chat because we're going to go into all about tau with Dr. Steen so that we can better understand what exactly happens in a scientific kind of a way to let everybody know how important this part is of head impacts. Okay, so moving back into the conversation, can you tell me what CTE-ALS is?
So CTE ALS is the buildup of the tau protein in your spine and brain. And ALS is a motor neuron disease where your neurons that control your motor function stop communicating with your brain. It's because the wiring is clogged with tau. They believe it comes from trauma to the brain and spine.
And we're going to get into more of this with Dr. Steen. When did you start having symptoms of CTE and ALS?
Now that I know the symptoms, my first symptoms started my junior year. It was muscle twitches. I just thought they were from always working out.
Do you think your diagnosis is related to playing a contact sport, specifically football?
Yes, I believe it is directly related to head trauma during college football. The young age I was diagnosed is extremely rare for the disease. Most people with non-genetic ALS are diagnosed in their 70s. I've also tested negative for all the genetic types of ALS.
The point of this conversation is to help others in youth sport. For those parents considering having their child play hockey, football, rugby, or even heading a ball in soccer, what would your advice be for them?
My advice is to educate and talk to your kids about all the different symptoms of a concussion. Most likely, there aren't many knockout blows, so parents and coaches could be observant and know what questions to ask.
How can you make an impact with decision makers that are able to make changes to youth sport in order to keep kids playing while keeping them safe?
I really don't know how to get through to organizations. The NCAA and NFL sat on information for decades, and these topics have been written about in medical journals since the 20s, and the NCAA continually chose not to participate and acknowledge the research. Their negligible acts have come out in the multiple lawsuits. It wasn't until lawsuits were filed that they started taking precautions.
So at this point, rather than doing a fact check at the end, I'm just going to read a few statements just so that I can show both sides of the NCAA as well as Matt's statement. I just want to make sure that I do my due diligence in providing all of the information that I can. So, in order to help understand Matt's statement, I found some information first from an article entitled The First Concussion Crisis: Head Injury and Evidence in Early American Football from the National Center for Biotechnology Information. Quote, as anxiety mounted over the death of a student from head injury in 1906, the Harvard College team doctors released a damning and unambiguous report on the physical aspects of American football in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, printed on page 1. Dismissing ongoing tinkering with reforms, the doctors came down entirely against the game from its medical standpoint. Their article systematically documenting the nature and number of injuries sustained by the team over the 1905 season highlighted one injury in particular that had been hiding in plain sight: concussion of the brain. The concept of brain concussion had been traveling through common and medical usage for centuries. As early as the mid 16th century, it had been defined as a blow resulting in escape of blood from ruptured tissue. By the early 19th century, it was described as an external violence that caused derangement of the organization of the brain. Though, as the authors of the BMSJ report noted, players were unlikely to acknowledge injury and tended to treat concussion as a joke. It was clear that when a condition like this develops as the result of an injury, the central nervous system has received a very severe shaking up. The doctors could not extrapolate from their small one-season sample to make strong claims about the long-term consequences of concussion, and neurologists had not studied football injuries in particular. But those tasked with judging evidence for policy and practice took a stance. The American Medical Association reported that, although there was a time when it was considered that convulsions and other untoward incidents of the unconscious life of the individual were not likely to be followed by serious consequences, this is not the opinion at the present time. And I would just like to read a little bit from Sports Illustrated, which was published on May 5th of this year, 2021. And that states, quote, in the last 5 years alone, college sports has stripped the teeth from fall camp in the name of safety, softening one of the more grueling traditional rites of passage for NCAA football players. Officials have eliminated two-a-days, slashed practice days, added mandatory off days, and reduced camp rosters. The fifth change to fall camp in 6 years is expected to happen this month. So that would be May of this year, 2021. As Sports Illustrated reported 2 weeks ago, officials are poised to abolish long-standing collision drills, such as the Oklahoma drill, and reduce the number of full padded contact practices and scrimmages that coaches can conduct in camp. So there are changes that are being made now, and I think we're going to just jump back into this conversation, and I'm going to highlight a few more facts as we go. So, Matt, what is your life like now? Do you think what you're going through could have been prevented?
Now, physically, I'm basically a vegetable. I require 24-hour skilled nursing. This disease definitely could have been prevented. If I was educated about the signs, symptoms, and consequences, it definitely would have changed my decision about playing Division II football.
I think your story is going to be so powerful, and I'm so, so sorry that this is where life is for you now. It's hard. It's hard for me to read this part because I know you as the vibrant and alive person that you were in college. So I'm really sorry. A quote from the NCAA website: how does the NCAA support student athlete well being? So, again, I'm just throwing in fact checking just to make sure that I do my part here. The NCAA sponsors a number of health and safety initiatives, including a program collecting and analyzing injury incidence data in order to help create safer competition, championship and year round drug testing that helps protect student athletes and ensure fair play, and grants promoting health and safety research, as well as the prevention of alcohol and drug abuse on college campuses. Now, that was updated on October 15th, 2013. For those that don't know what it would be like to rely on 100% care from other people, what is that like, Matt?
Relying on other people for everything is worse than you can imagine, especially when it is difficult to communicate those needs. Trying to get comfortable is very difficult. I still feel everything, I just can't do anything about it.
Now, I know that you're trying to prove your case against the NCAA. Is there anything that you're allowed to tell me that would be impactful for other college and NFL football players based on playing for an organization and not being supported after the fact with medical problems?
The day you stop playing sports for an organization, they're done covering any insurance issues. All my health insurance came from my employer and now Medicare. There are many advantages to playing sports, but I think once you get to the college level, you have to start to consider risk versus reward.
And here I will just insert a quote from the NFL. This is based on the NFL retirement. Quote, the proposed CBA includes major improvements that we at NFL alumni sought for many months from owners and the union, reads a statement on the NFL alumni website. The document includes higher pensions, some by as much as 60% for all alumni, a reduction in pension requirements from 4 to 3 vested seasons for all alumni, and a $50,000 health reimbursement account for all vested players who previously had not been eligible due to their retirement date. Also, according to the release from the NFL Player Alumni website, the new CBA calls for all retired players to receive free or low-cost screenings, preventative care, mental health services, and orthopedic care at a new national network of top hospitals created by the owner and the union. All of this is crucial considering what we've learned in recent years about the long-term physical and mental effects of playing football. The complete CBA has not yet been made available. Now, that was from March 15th, 2020, and that's from NBC Sports. Now, I'm going to include a lot of information from the NCAA website because might be lengthy for me to read here, but there's some background information on student athletes. I'll just read the first part that says the NCAA Insurance Task Force wanted to ensure that student athletes would have adequate insurance coverage to medical expenses from injuries sustained during participation in intercollegiate sport activities. The NCAA provides insurance excess of a significant deductible through the NCAA Catastrophic Injury Insurance Program, but previously there was not a consistent method or requirement to verify insurance for expenses within the catastrophic program deductible. I'll include the full quote in my notes for this conversation so that you can find out more from the NCAA. Okay, back to our conversation here. Could you pass along some advice to coaches, Matt, working with youth athletes? How should they run their practices to decrease their athletes' risk of head injury? And how can they make positive impacts on football culture, where we mainly see things as being tough and manly and maybe not even speaking up when you get hurt?
All I can recommend for youth sports is to educate players on symptoms and have a culture where it is okay to report an injury.
Okay. If you could make a change with youth sport, what would you do?
If I can make any changes to youth sports, it would be the age they start playing. 6-year-olds don't need to be tackling and banging their heads. A helmet prevents skull injuries, but it doesn't protect the brain at all.
And we're going to get into more of this with Dr. Steen in part 2. Looking back, was football worth playing?
Definitely not at the college level. That is the level where you have to weigh risks and rewards. The size and speed of the game is almost more than the human anatomy can handle.
Now, you mentioned to me that even if you don't have symptoms of head injuries at the time, there could be long-term consequences. What education should parents know in order to realize the importance of head contact in sport?
I would tell parents to probe your kids after a game. Ask specific questions about the symptoms. Don't trust that an organization or a coach will have your child's best interest in mind. About 5 years ago, when my daughters played soccer, they were teaching them how to head the ball. I had to stop the drill. people still need to be educated about what is causing your brain to smack against your skull. Even if there are no symptoms, there are long-term consequences.
Can you tell me what the statistics of CTE autopsies are? What are the percentages of athletes with CTE at autopsy?
From the Brain and Spine Bank at Boston University, the percentage of CTE diagnosis at autopsy is NFL is 99%, NCAA is 91%, high school is 21%, youth is 18%. These numbers were based on approximately 4,000 autopsies, but the numbers have remained consistent as the bank grows.
Okay, and so I asked Dr. Thor Steen about these statistics and how articles have been written in order to show that this data could be skewed. And we're going to go into that further so that everybody understands where these numbers come from. But that's a pretty high percentage, which would make me concerned. And I hope that causes other people to think about just what could be happening with your child. And Dr. Steen goes into it's based on the amount of years of play. So we're going to go into that some more. Do you have former teammates that have health issues due to playing football?
Yes, I actually don't have a friend who doesn't have some kind of old injury that continues to nag them.
Have you joined any support groups of former athletes dealing with similar situations?
No official groups, but I am in contact with quite a few of the younger players who have ALS. We managed to find each other somehow.
If anyone is struggling and unsure of what to do, what's your advice to get help?
Just don't be afraid to reach out to a trainer or a doctor to get help.
Okay. How did you feel when you first found out you had ALS with the suspicion of CTE as well?
I lived in denial when I was diagnosed. It didn't make sense for many reasons. I went to the doctors because one cold day at a fire, I had trouble getting my left glove on because I couldn't wiggle my fingers in. I thought I had a pinched nerve or something. I was still able to work as a firefighter for 4 years after I was diagnosed. So it didn't really hit me as much as I eased into it.
Now, sport identity is a big thing. If you identified as an athlete your whole life and then didn't have the ability to be athletic any longer, what was that like?
Having an identity is something I still struggle with. I want to be able to help people, but I also know that requires other people to do the helping for me. I hate being the person who always talks about doing something instead of being able to be someone who just does it.
Yeah, that's got to be really hard. As your condition progressed, what emotions did you go through? Denial, frustration, sadness? What came up for you?
As the disease progressed, I definitely had determination. I knew that once I stopped doing something, I would never be able to do it again. It led to a few falls and injuries, but I believe I have delayed progression. Even now, I still make sure I pull my elbows up to my arm rests because I know one day I won't be able to, and I will be stuck in an uncomfortable position. Also, frustration. Mentally, I'm still the same. I'm a busybody who wants to do things, but I realize I have to burden other people to do them for me.
Yeah, that's crazy. And it almost gives us a sense of how we should be living every day, where when you say you have to make sure that you're doing things because one day you won't be able to, I don't think enough of us have that urgency to think about our health and wellness in the same kind of capacity. Now, you went skydiving and downhill skiing after your ALS diagnosis. What was that like?
Skydiving was probably the best minute I've ever had. The free falls were the most peaceful and exciting moments of my life. I felt in total control. It wasn't the feeling I expected at all, but something I became addicted to. I was able to go 3 times. The final time I had to travel to Davis, California, because they had the only guy who would take me. Once I became so disabled that I couldn't stand up when landing. Skiing was something I've always done, so luckily, there is a volunteer adaptive ski program in Western Pennsylvania. It was always a lot of fun and it gave me the opportunity to ski with my daughters. To me, these sports had nothing to do with escaping death. It's really the only time I could live in the moment and have everything slow down.
I thought about your college coaches this past week as I was thinking about you saying that you wouldn't have played college football if you knew what the outcome would have been on your health. Have you spoken to your coaches since playing?
I have spoken to my coaches over the years. I hope they don't feel any responsibility. I've also spoken to Mike Steinagel, who was an athletic trainer working with the football program. What I was taught and the way I was treated were the best practices at the time. The information was still being hidden.
So now I feel like the quote from Maya Angelou is really important. Do the best you can. When you know better, do better. So, with you trying to get the NCAA to do better since they know better, what would you say to college coaches that are working with impressionable young men and some women in football?
I would tell coaches to continue to follow best practices. It really isn't reasonable for a coach to keep track of medical journals or for these journals to continuously send information to every coach. The entire purpose of the NCAA was because in 1906, President Roosevelt was going to ban college football because 9 college players died of head injuries the previous year. The medical journals have sent numerous letters and requested several meetings over the century. The NCAA response was always to turn a blind eye because otherwise they would have to act.
Okay, we're going to get into that a little bit too. So, the fact check on the NCAA turning a blind eye to medical requests. This is a quote from InsideHire.com. Quote, not even medical professionals understood it to the extent they do now, Mitten said. But such information was available, at least to a degree. As early as 1928, the Journal of the American Medical Association used punch drunk as a way to describe the condition of boxers who took multiple blows to the head. The NCAA also referred to punch drunk in its medical handbook published in 1933. It recommended players sit out at least 48 hours after a concussion. Numerous other studies on concussions emerged before 2010 when the NCAA required its member institutions to form concussion management plans for athletes who were concussed or suspected to be. The athletes weren't allowed to play the same day they were possibly concussed, nor were they allowed to return until a medical professional had cleared them. Prior to this, the rules were inconsistent or non existent at some colleges. So this pretty much wraps up my conversation with Matthew. We were back and forth with our emails. And I know Matthew works on a computer where he's communicating with his eyes. The technology is incredible, and Matthew is so proficient at it. And I know that he's there. And what is so disheartening is that this disease really does take away so much from the person, even though the person is there. And I really just want to say thank you to Matt for sharing his story. And I know that your story is going to make a difference. The biggest thing, again, that I just want to say is that Matt just wants to make sure that our kids are in better care and that they can make good decisions. Not only that they can make decisions, but that parents and coaches can make good decisions. And if his legacy can do anything, it's to make change for the better of everyone. And I just want to really make sure that we are all doing our part in that. And I thank you, Matt, for that. There's one more fact check that I will go through, and then we're going to wrap up this conversation. But I thought it was really interesting, the information about President Roosevelt and college football. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to provide this in the notes at the end. But just to give you an idea of where all this started to come from, this quote comes from dailyhistory.org. Quote, Roosevelt made his first initiative to clean up football on October 9th, 1905, by summoning the coaches and administrators of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, the big three collegiate powers, to Washington for a summit. He admonished his guests to set an example of fair play for gridiron behavior across the country. Roosevelt may have even threatened to ban football with an executive order if they failed to comply with his wishes. It's also possible that Roosevelt pointed out the need to fix football immediately and pointed those in charge in that direction to ensure that young men could receive quasi-militaristic training. The schools issued public statements pledging to clean up the games and denounce the brutality that had been embedded into the game. Now, if there's more information that I'll provide here, and it is really interesting, so if you'd like to check that out, you can check out my notes there. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. This is the end of part 1. Part 2, you can check out immediately. I've got that released as well. And you can learn all about the science and the advice from the man who's working in the brain bank. He's seeing exactly what the results are of contact sport on the brain. So you can check that out. My conversation with Dr. Thor Steen is coming up next. Thanks so much again, Matthew Onyshko. I send love to you and to your family, and thank you so much for everything that you've done. Thank you, Mike, for taking the time to read Matt's answers. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Have a great day, everybody. I'll see you on the next conversation.